Okay, so we are right at time. Again, if this is the first time you're joining us, welcome to our 13th session of our Thought Leadership Series. My name is Jason White. I'm the founder, president, and CEO for the National Reentry Workforce Collaborative. I'm really grateful that you're able to join us today. We'll be spending the next hour together. We have two exciting speakers that will be talking on the topic of navigating barriers to occupational licensing. And as many of us know, occupational licensing is one of those things within the field where there are barriers for folks who are impacted by the justice system, particularly justice impacted job seekers. You know, in many cases, these individuals are even told that they should not pursue careers in certain industries. And I am very excited about today's topic because we have two experts in the field, and these are two persons that are focused very, very different in the field, coming from very different perspective. And they'll be sharing or shedding some light on how individuals can navigate some of those barriers. So I am super excited to introduce them. But before we do that, I have a quick announcement to share with you. We're literally about 5 weeks out from our conference. We will be meeting in Denver in person, Denver, Colorado, from the 15th of October to the 17th of October. So it's 2.5 days. We're going to get some great content, get a chance to meet some like-minded people. So if you have not registered for a conference yet, please do. Last year, we had a conference in Philadelphia, and we had a waiting list of over 50 people. So if you have not registered yet, please do register because we're getting close to that number. So we're looking forward to spending some time together in Denver and really getting connected more and growing and learning from each other. Anyway, that being said, I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Again, our topic is navigating barriers to occupational licensing. Today, we have the privilege of hearing from Caroline Miller, who's a partner in the regulatory consulting group. She has a long history in regulation. And we also have Randy Anderson, who is the owner of Old North Recovery. And Randy is a very, very unique story. I'm really excited to spending some time and digging into this conversation. So at this time, I'm going to invite both Caroline and Randy to come and join me. And I'm just going to give them a few minutes to introduce themselves. And then afterwards, we will dig into the content that we have for you today. Randy, we'll start with you.
All right, sounds good. Thank you. Thanks, Jason. And thank you all for attending. I'm looking at all the cities that everyone's putting in, and literally, like, it's amazing. This is such a needed conversation, and I'm so grateful that this is happening. So my name is Randy Anderson, and I'm a person living in long-term recovery. And what that means to me is I haven't used any alcohol or drugs or mood-altering substance since January 9th, 2005. So 19 years, 20 is right around the corner. I chuckle only a little because I always say if I don't put my recovery first, everything else comes last. But 20 years is like 2 decades. Wow. But boy, I'm starting to feel a little old when I say that. I'm also, I think, more importantly for this conversation, at least, is I'm also a formerly incarcerated person that was sentenced to 87 months in prison as a first-time nonviolent drug user with no criminal history. And I ended up, by the grace of God, or whatever your higher power might be, I only ended up spending 60 months. And my normal friends, when I say only, they kind of like, what do you mean only? I said, well, I got in a lot of trouble once in my life, and if they wanted to throw the book at me, my maximum sentence was 156 months. And so to only serve 60 in prison, I really look at that as a blessing. I wear a lot of hats. I call myself a citizen lobbyist. I do a ton of work in advocacy and legislative work here in Minnesota, although I'm not a paid lobbyist, and I really don't think I ever want to be one, because when you're a citizen lobbyist, you get to pick and choose what you like to work on. My belief is the intersection between criminal justice reform and substance use disorder and recovery are so intertwined that when you work on one, you automatically work on the other without a choice. So that's a passion of mine. More recently, a lot on the recovery and SUD and this side versus the criminal justice side. Again, they're both so intertwined, it's almost hard to talk about you can't talk about one without talking about the other. So I'm just grateful to be here, and I hope you all get some valuable information while we're here. And yeah, so I'll end there.
Awesome. Thank you, Randy. I appreciate you joining us. Caroline.
Hey, everyone. Thank you so much for your time today. I know everyone is busy, and so we really appreciate that. And also just want to reiterate that this conversation is very necessary. And I'm grateful to Jason and his whole team for putting this together. So my name's Caroline Miller. I actually started out my career as an optician. I was a licensed optician and contact lens fitter for many years. And then I became a regulator. Every little girl's dream, I know. And so I fell into it. I was like most of us, it was not done on purpose. I'll admittedly tell you that. But I've been in regulation for almost 30 years, which makes me feel really old, Randy. So I feel you there. But I was the executive director of a healthcare association for about 13 years. And past president of the Council on Licensure Enforcement and Regulation, which is an international organization that brings together regulators and has these kinds of conversations. And I have a degree in adult education, which really sort of wraps up, I think, nicely some of the places where I hope that I can be helpful in this conversation today. So that's me. Looking forward to it.
Awesome. Well, again, thank you. And again, I'll say this to you again, both Randy and Caroline, the time that you're spending here is an investment in the field. So we're so grateful that you are choosing to give up your time and contribute in this way. Thank you so much. Before we get into the conversation, I do want to just highlight that if you have a question at any point of the conversation, please do share that in the Q&A pod. However, you're free to make as much comment as you want in the chat pod as well. But for questions specifically, just so we don't miss your question, if you could share that in the Q&A pod, that would be great. The idea is that at the end of this session, we're going to spend some time trying to respond to as many questions as we possibly can. So at any point in time, share your question, but we will get to them mostly at the end of the webinar. Okay, so Randy, I would love to start with you. You have a very, very interesting story. You know, as you were talking and as I got to meet you, the more I spent time with Randy, the more I learned that he does. He's a person with lived experience. He is a practitioner. He's a trainer. He's a lobbyist, volunteer lobbyist, by the way, and it's certainly an advocate in his own right, right? And Randy, you've been having such a great impact. And again, the more I learn about you, the more I'm encouraged to hear all the work and impact that you've been having. I don't want to keep that to myself. Could you share a little bit more about your story with the audience? And as you're talking, if you could just keep this idea in mind, how do licensing requirements affect justice impacted job seekers, right? And even talking from your own perspective and your own journey.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. And I just want to shout out to, I see a certified peer recovery specialist from Brainerd, Minnesota is logged in. That's great.
Awesome.
I probably know this person and the name looks really familiar, but anyways, so I think what I didn't say in my introduction, I think is really important too, is so yes, I am also a licensed alcohol and drug counselor. I'm a certified peer recovery specialist. Actually, the official title is recovery coach professional facilitator, which Carolyn and I talked about how the hodgepodge of names we have for certified peer recovery specialists and licensed alcohol and drug counselors across the United States is rather frustrating at times, but I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole right now. But I think for me, this journey started. So I always say the second scariest day of my life was going to college. The first was going to prison. And when I went to college to become a licensed alcohol and drug counselor, I knew nothing about this world. I was very like, I didn't even like, how does a bill get passed? How does I was brand new to all of it. But I remember, I'm going to fast forward to when I started my practicum class, and we have to do what's called background studies. And in Minnesota, if you're licensed, you're regulated by mainly the Department of Human Services here. You have to go through what's called a background study, which is very similar in a lot of states. We have a little statute, it's not so little, called 245C15, which I have become intimately friendly with, unfortunately, because so in my practicum class, we do our first background study. We submit the form, they send you back a letter. either you're approved, you're not approved, or there's that third letter that sometimes we need more information. At that point, it really doesn't seem so bad. I got the letter that said we need more information first, well, which means they had to take a little bit more time just to, dig into my criminal background. Eventually, it came back clear, and I was able to continue in my studies. And then I did my first internship at the very same treatment center program where I found recovery, called Eden House in Minneapolis. It's been around since 1971. When I did that internship, I had to do another background study. And that one also came back, need more information. Eventually it cleared it. It happened a little quicker this time because I think, they did one, and it's just weird to me how they have to keep doing it every time, which is still that way. Unfortunately, we haven't made, even with some of the good work we've done, we haven't changed it. But anyways, so I did that. I did my second internship. I had to do another one. So I did another one and came back clear. So 3 times they cleared me. And then I took a job while I was doing my second internship. I was also working as a tech, like overnight tech. So, but I had been cleared 3 times to work. Well, I finally got licensed in Minnesota. After you get your 2-year degree, you can go and work under what's called a temporary permit. It's called an ADCT. It means you're on the path to a fully licensed individual. So I got my temporary permit, and then they had to do another background study. And this is the one where it changed my life. I was sitting in my office at Eden House. I was now a counselor, and I got a call to come down to the director's office. And I'm like, it seemed odd, right? I get down there, and he just hands me this letter and says, "Can you read? This came today, and here." And he hands it to me, and I read it, and I get a little emotional because it was a really difficult day for me. It said that I am not cleared to work, that I have to be removed from counseling right now. I can't have any direct contact with clients. Basically, like, I had to be escorted out of the building. Wow. I would say the best part about my recovery is I got my feelings back. The worst part about my recovery is I got my feelings back. And so I was escorted up to my office. And let's keep in mind, this is a program where I had found my recovery, right? And many years ago, it was my home where I was in residential treatment. I lived there, right? So it meant a lot to me, not just on a professional level, but a very personal level. And here I am basically being escorted out, grab my belongings and leave the building. And I just will never forget that day. And of course I insisted this is a mistake. They've cleared me 3 times. How can I be all of a sudden disqualified? And so I left, and I started to look into the process. I knew nothing, right? And I had to figure this out. The one thing the director said, once I get my letter in the mail, I can bring it back in. I can say I've received my letter, and I'm starting the reconsideration process to get what we call a set aside, to have my crime set aside so I could work in the field. Well, my letter didn't show up for a long time, and I can't go back to work until I get the letter. I couldn't even believe. I was really shocked that there's still something this important that they're actually still mailing to people in the US mail, right? Eventually, 10 days later, and it was Labor Day weekend, ironically enough, and here we are just finishing Labor Day weekend. So 10 days later, I still haven't received my letter. I drive down to my Department of Human Services headquarters in St. Paul, Minnesota, and I demanded that I get a copy of this letter so I can go back to work, because I can't even return to work until I have this official copy. And they did. After I was there about an hour, someone produced the letter, and the next day I was able to return to work. But that started my journey on this extremely broken system around disqualifying people like myself. And I'll never forget, so when I finally and I'm gonna jump ahead a little, I finally did my set aside and got it approved, and it was like 70 pages long, because you have to answer all these questions and get police reports and do all this stuff. I had a letter of recommendation from at that time, Hennepin County Sheriff Rich Stanek. And the sheriff wrote in his letter, which I was surprised he actually wrote it himself, but he did. He said at the end, I don't understand how the person most qualified to do this job is being not allowed to do this job. He didn't, I'm paraphrasing how he worded it, but he says, we want people just like Mr. Anderson in these positions to help other people that are going through the similar struggles. And so to me, that was just a line that I wish I had said it better than the way he said it, but it's just like, that is the way, like, my lived experience is what really drives me in the work I do today. Even I have these, I think it's cool that I have these fun initials after my name now, right? But I think now when I look at the work I do, I think my two most important credentials in my life are my 19 years of recovery and my 5 years of incarceration, but they don't give me initials to put after my name for that. And that lived experience and that life experience is what really, I think, drives me and helps me to help other people. So I went to work on fixing this. I'm going to fix this broken system. Well, that is not, and many of you probably know, or I'm sure a lot of you know, that it's not an easy task. And unfortunately, 8 years later, when I got first disqualified in 2015 or 16. So yes, 8 years later, even with some of the changes we've made, it's still an sometimes impossible system for people to navigate. And it really makes me sad because there are so many good people that could be working in my field, that aren't allowed to because of what they did when they were 19 years old or,
Yeah.
So yeah, I hope that answers it. I'm not trying to go too long there, but yeah, it really, really started my journey on this path.
Mhm. Well, listen, thank you so much for sharing your story, Randy, and even for your being willing to even be honest and vulnerable with us. Really, really appreciate that. And, as you were talking, one of the things that struck me is the same place that when you find solace and recovery and refuge, you were unfortunately asked to leave, right? Unannounced, just abruptly. I can't even imagine how difficult that must have been. And you know what? With all of those circumstances that we have and experiences, we have a choice to make after having those experiences. And your choice was to double down and find a way to ensure that you can practice, but also know your others. So I just want to thank you for that. And I'm grateful that you're able to be here with us today again. So thank you so much, Randy.
So I come from a sales background, and as a salesperson, we don't know how to take no for an answer.
That's
So
great.
I always say, when I even work with gentlemen in finding recovery, I say we have transferable skills. And to me, that sales background is very much a transferable skill into a lot of other things, right?
Yes.
They say it takes 7 no's to get a yes, right? So
Mm-hmm.
anyways, I always laugh because I think that's what drives me, is that I just don't know how to take no for an answer. So
Got it. Thank you so much. Well, listen, Caroline, I'm equally excited to hear from you, actually. And I remember when I just connected, one of the first things that I said is, help me to understand the role of a regulator, because in my experience, we've talked about occupational licensing so many years, and I've never had a conversation about the role of the regulators or even a conversation with a regulator. So we're really excited to have you join this conversation. You're muted, but I have a question for you. So if you could unmute yourself, that would be great.
Sure.
How are occupational and professional licensing requirement created and revised? And as you're talking about this, if you could talk a little bit about the unique role of the regulator plays in the process, it would be great to shed some light on that.
Sure, absolutely. And I just want to echo, thank you, Randy, so much for sharing that story. It's so important, and it reminds me of something that regulators don't do well, which is we don't remember that it's about people, and we get bogged down in the process. And that is something that we need to be reminded of, because it isn't about the paper, it isn't about the legislation, right? It's about the people that are trying to help the people that need the help. So I just want to put that out there. So thank you so much. That's really important. So I will answer your question, Jason. I'm going to talk about something called sunrise and sunset, and I'll explain what those are. But if I could, I'm just going to back up for just a minute and maybe head up to about 30,000 feet and
Please.
sort of think about like the structure. Like, so what's the point, right? There's a lot of noise, there's a lot of activity, there's a lot of people involved in sort of what is it that we're trying to accomplish, generally speaking, as a regulator. If that's okay, if I can start there, and I'll try and keep it concise. Okay. So the purpose of regulation is for a couple things. So state oversight is the first one, public protection also, which you all know, standard setting, consumer choice is one that I think that gets forgotten quite often. So that is to say that when a consumer goes to use a service or, use a product, that they can reasonably expect what the outcome is and that it will be similar no matter what practitioner they go to.
Yeah.
And also another piece of it that gets lost sometimes is accountability. We talk a lot about complaints. You hear about complaints, docs are always, in the news about complaints. I'm not picking on them. They're just, most people care about that. But there is an accountability mechanism that's built into regulation, which is complaints and discipline. So that is to say, we want to hold you accountable for, we've bestowed this license on you, saying you've met all the criteria to practice, but now you need to be responsible for the work that you do, and we need a way to enforce that. So that's sort of the whole purpose. Do we always get it right? Absolutely not. But that is the driving force sort of behind regulation. So just to put it in a little bit of perspective, in the US in 1964, about 5% of occupations had a license requirement. And fast forward to this year, it's about 25% of the workforce requires a license. So this is a huge jump. This is not insignificant in the world of economic impact, in the world of workforce. And in the world of agency administration. There are about 1,000 state occupational and professional licensing boards in the US, which is just mind-numbing. And then I'm going to follow that mind-numbing statement up with the regulatory structures are vastly different. So it depends on what jurisdiction you're in, and it depends on what profession you're talking about. So there are, and they're all different, and we cannot agree on the best way to proceed. We can't agree on language, and we can't agree on the best way to proceed with regulation. There are things like right touch regulation. There are things like risk-based regulation. None of those have really come to fruition. So that's just sort of my preface when I talk about regulation. We don't agree. But in terms of structures, there are basically two kinds of structures. There's an autonomous board, which is like a medical board. And then there are central agencies, which so one agency, for example, in Colorado, DORA would house 50 different boards, some health, some non-health, and they're all run under a central agency. So those are the two primary ways that we get to regulation. And it's the same around the world. I will say most of the world leans towards autonomous boards. And so then that leads to legislative versus administrative authority. So some boards are given pieces of legislation and told, do this, this is your work. We don't actually care what you think. Just do it, right? And then other boards, more so autonomous boards, are collaborated with and said, listen, we know that we recognize that you have expertise in this because you are made up of professionals. And so we want your opinion, we want your advice, and we want you to help us understand how we can best implement. So really what happens is a piece of legislation is generated or given, and then a regulatory board is in charge of administering that. So it's sort of like the how are you going to accomplish that? So you can regulate, I always try and say you can regulate people, places, and things. So you can regulate people, nurses, teachers, accountants, funeral directors. You can regulate places, pharmacies, public schools, farms, and you can regulate things like medical devices, contact lenses, public transportation systems. So this is as you can imagine, this touches almost every aspect of our daily lives, right? Yeah. So this is a fairly large undertaking. So what are the component parts of regulation, specifically where we're talking about professional and occupational licensing? So what are the bits and pieces that we consider to be parts of a license? So firstly, the premise is it's based on a risk of harm, which is to say, if somebody were to perform an act and they were not qualified, there is a risk to the general public that something bad would happen. If there is not a risk of harm that you're able to establish through evidence-based research, you're probably not going to see a license there to some degree or other. It is, and there are some more extreme cases and there are some lighter cases, but all in all, there needs to be a risk of harm present in order to require a license. So think of engineers, right? Building a bridge. This is a significant risk of harm if they're not doing what it is that they're required to do. So the next piece of it is standard setting. So we talk about things like scope of practice. What activities are included? What are you allowed to do? What are you not allowed to do? And you'll see, particularly in the healthcare arena, there is a lot of, again, we don't agree on what those scopes of practice look like. There's also a lot of overlap, particularly in sort of umbrella groups like behavioral health. You'll see a lot of overlap and you'll see a lot of language difference. But generally speaking, each license will have a scope of practice, which is to say this is what you're allowed to do.
Got it.
The entry to practice is probably most germane to this conversation. And this is where we sort of think about competencies. We do job task analysis. We do educational requirements, examinations. We accredit educational institutions. We require practice hours, liability insurance. So this is just sort of what you need to get into the, or to even apply, I think is probably a better word, right? Then there is continuing competence. There's something that we consider, we call it a rust factor. So in this world, you get your education here and then you don't really need to go back. Once you get it, it's a one and done kind of a thing. So we believe that continuing competence is required. So every license will have some sort of a requirement for continuing education or hours or some sort of learning, professional learning, so that you can keep current. Particularly these days, things change really quickly. So that's important. Then there's the accountability piece that I talked about earlier, which is complaints, investigations, discipline, unauthorized practice. So we see some people out there sort of putting up a sign that says I'm allowed to do this thing, and they're not qualified to do that thing. They don't have a license. Unfortunately, that's quite prevalent, and that falls to the regulator to administer. It is difficult to do something about that because they don't have a license. We can only manage inside of the license. We can take away your license. We can put restrictions on your license. If you don't have anything, it tends to go through civil or criminal cases, which is kind of messy. And we're not really good at that, but that's a different conversation. And then finally, there's agency administration, which is registration process. There's some public awareness. License lookup if you want to know who has a license and who doesn't, or if they have any discipline findings against them. So that's sort of those are the, like, in the high level, that's the big box of what regulation looks like. Sorry, go ahead, Jason. Yeah.
No. Even as you talk, I'm curious to hear if Randy has any thoughts on it, because what you're describing is a multifaceted system, so to say. But it sounds like at the core of what you describe is this idea of protecting the public, so to say, or mitigating risk for the public. I'm even curious to hear maybe further conversation on that and how that could even shape how we look at these licensing. Randy, I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
Well, I mean, I think the biggest thing is that I didn't know until I was offered to do this webinar. I told Carolyn, I didn't even know what a regulator did. Like, who are you people? Like, right. And where are you? Like, I mean, like, so it was really like, I just learned a ton more even just now listening to her description there. But I think it's important to know that I do serve on a licensing board in Minnesota. I was appointed by Governor Walz to our what's called BBHT, Board of Behavioral Health and Therapy, and a lot of the things that Carolyn just talked about is 100%. We're a legislatively directed board, so everything we enforce or have to do is all legislatively done. So, which I like when you said, here you go. We don't care what you say. Here's what you have to do. You're right. That's exactly what it is. And I didn't even know there was another type of board, which is also interesting. I just learned that. I just want to hit on the one thing that really stuck out to me is when we do get a significant amount of complaints around unlicensed people. And now there's this new thing, like I'm a life coach or and we don't like I'm not here to bash anybody if they think that's something that they want to do, but oftentimes they'll present themselves as like a licensed individual. And we use our Attorney General's office here in Minnesota to help send cease and desist letters or to take action against, but that of course all costs a lot of money to do. And so we have a big budget. Part of our budget is all using our attorney general's office for their lawyer time and things like that. So, but I think I just like, thank you for that big overview, because I think it was so helpful for me to learn who is a regulator and what do they do? Like, that to me, I was a whole foreign, I had no idea until I was invited to do this webinar and then hearing you talk about it again. So, yeah.
Awesome. Well, I'm so glad. I was saying earlier, everyone, that I try not to use regulatory speaker language. So somebody's going to check me if I do that. I know everybody uses acronyms. We all get to have our own acronyms. But so then, like, if I could, Jason, just get back to the part of your question where you asked about how are regulations made and how are they changed.
Okay.
There's a formal process that we use. So a sunrise process is
Yes.
where oftentimes a group will come to a legislator or an administrative body and say, listen, we think that we should have a license. We think that we present a risk of harm if somebody does what we do.
Yes.
So we call it a sunrise review. Things like recently homeopathy, kinesiology, these are newly licensed, newly regulated professions that have sort of grown out of, the way the world works these days. I can give you an example. In Colorado, DORA athletic trainers made a sunrise review request and they were successful. So now in order to be an athletic trainer, you need a license. That was not true that long ago. Another one, interior designers. They made a bid to Colorado DORA, which is the Occupational Regulatory Authority in Colorado. Sorry, there's my acronym. I did it. I just said it and I did it. Interior designers were unsuccessful. They were not able to prove that there was a risk of harm. So there's the sunrise. That's how we create license and regulation. There's also a sunset, which is we want to see if existing licensing regulations should be continued, modified, eliminated. Do they pose unnecessary barriers to workforce issues? And so, for example, again, in Colorado, barbers and cosmetologists, went under a sunset review and their regulations were made far less stringent. So they still established that there was a risk of harm, but not all of those requirements. The other one was funeral directors, and they were actually deregulated, and they were, so now I understand that Colorado regulates funeral homes, which is the place, but not the funeral director, but there is a title protection requirement. So it dropped from sort of a licensing requirement down to a title protection, which just means that you can't call yourself that unless you have done a couple of things. So anyway, just wanted to call that out. And there is an instance where there's some unintended collateral damage that is done if you deregulate and you don't be careful about it. And the one that I'll call out is just the 2007, 2008 housing bubble, where they really attributed part of that recession to a deregulation in the financial industry. And those changes were made. And so there is real fallout there.
I appreciate that. And I mean, I think most of us can identify with the impact that has had. Not, I'll say all of us, whether we realize it or not. So that being said, one of the things that blew my mind, and I'm asking both you and Randy to tag team on this one. We talk about some of the misconceptions that are out there in the air, right? And sometimes literally govern how we function. I'm curious to hear what are some of the key misconceptions. And I do remember both of you from different perspectives share some statistics that I'd love for our audience to hear. So please talk about some of the misconceptions.
Sure. Randy, do you want to?
Yeah, this was interesting to me. And the way we both came to very similar numbers from different ends of the world. So through my journey, we had last 2 legislative sessions ago, our legislation here in Minnesota, we decided to put together a background studies task force. And so we had put together a group of people, subject matter experts, which included lawyers, of course, and people impacted by the justice system. But some of the data that came out of that was very interesting and shocking. And I'm just going to talk about a couple of those data points. But one, so the exact number is somewhere between like 75 and 80%. But when a person gets that letter that I got from DHS saying you're disqualified, in Minnesota, of course, this is Minnesota, but I would guess it's not that different from what I learned from Carolyn. About 75 to 80% of people get that letter and they stop.
Mm.
They believe that that is the end of the road for them, and they don't continue on or see if there's something else they can do, which I was completely floored when I heard that number. I thought, oh my God, that's so many people being just deciding, I can't fight this. I don't know how to get around this, whatever. And then the other side of that, we found out that actually people that submit or do a reconsideration, or we call set aside here, kind of a generic term, but people actually go through the process, more than 90% of them get granted their set aside.
Mm.
Very high numbers. So, God, I just think about if we could get those 75% that said, I don't want to continue, to actually continue, more than 90% of them would actually enter the workforce because they would be granted their set aside, or their reconsideration would be approved. And for me, I think that's the biggest misconception, is that individuals, or maybe even reentry workers, someone gets that letter and then they say, I'm
That's
done.
it.
I can't
Yeah.
continue. So yeah,
Yeah.
that's from this side. Now, Carolyn had some interesting statistics from her side. So yeah.
So they did a study in Colorado, and Colorado, just for context, is a central agency, so 50 boards, health and non-health. And they looked at 5,000 applications in 1 year across those 50 boards. Less than, I'm going to try and say this right, 0.005% were denied.
Wow.
Yeah.
Full out denied. So I think this is, as you say, Randy, I think people just don't realize, and I will say it's probably true that regulators, if they send this letter, when they send this letter that says you've not been granted the opportunity to pursue a license, they probably don't tell you that you have other ways and other things that you can do. So if just a person was receiving this letter, I mean, I think I too would be like, oh, well, so that's the end of the road, right? But that isn't the case. And we see that in the data, but also there are several paths. I mean, you can, and it depends, I know I hate saying this, but it depends on the jurisdiction and the profession, right? But you can request a written explanation. You can request an administrative review in some places, and they have this written into the legislation on purpose. You can address deficiencies. You can write them back and say, listen, tell me what it is that, made me, you denied my application. And if you can list out for me, what are the deficiencies so I can correct those. You can also, sometimes you can, although I don't recommend this, but you can seek licensure in another state because they're all different, right? So they're all going to have different good moral clauses. They're all going to have different background checks. And also associations do a lot of work in this place, right? So they lobby very hard to help their folks that are part of the professional association to get a license. And some also have ombudsmen. So if you can go to or they might call it something else, but there's sort of somebody that can help advocate for you to get that license, right?
Excellent. Thank you for sharing that, Caroline. And just so you know, we did put together a takeaway for this webinar that actually outlines some of the things Caroline just mentioned, because we do have persons even here. It seems as if this person, Lamaya, because it's so related, I'm just gonna ask her a question. I think Lamaya here, she says she applied for a job with Essential Health in the treatment center. Our background check came back. It seemed as if she has a waiting period. I think right now she's about 3 weeks or so in, and she's just asking what to do. Obviously, you may need a little bit more context from her, but I'm not sure if there's some general thoughts around maybe what she should be thinking at this point in time.
Actually, I don't need any more context than that. I know exactly what she's going through. I mean, just from what she wrote there and what you said, I really wish I had a better concrete answer for her, but I don't. But I'm going to tell her what some of the things are. So there's no time frame. Like they sometimes I've heard, some of these background studies, and it's because they have to dig at other states, but 6 months to a year, which is really sad because I've had friends been offered jobs, good jobs, and then they had to fill the position with a person that was, maybe not even as qualified because they could clear a background study, where another individual couldn't. So there's a couple of details that Leanna, I can't probably say her name correctly. So the Essential Health has this choice. I'm guessing she maybe got the letter that said we needed more information, what it looks like. As an employer, they can allow her to work while she's pursuing her set aside or reconsideration. There's like varying levels of letter. There's one that says like, we need more information, and then they just eventually send you a letter saying, oh, you're cleared. There's one that says you can work, but under supervision. And there's one that says you can't work at all, like until
Cease and
you,
desist.
yeah. So it sounds like you might be in that either the lowest one or the second one, but this is up to Essentia Health maybe, where they can say, well, we're going to allow you to continue to work while you pursue this process. But I'm wish I had better news, but background studies are averaging between 60 and 120 days to get completed and done. So so I suggest being a squeaky wheel. My wife calls me professionally persistent. I would be calling them or emailing them, or however you can contact them, maybe all the above, very frequently, even weekly, saying, hey, where are we at? Especially if your employer is like, if you haven't got the job yet because you're waiting on this, you need to be really squeaky. Like, you need to be very persistent and tell them, like, I'm waiting on my employment because of this. So I hope that answers it, but that's unfortunately, I can't give you an exact answer because, again, there's no exact answer for that. So, yeah.
I would just agree that
just keep at it is a big takeaway that I would have. Yeah.
And tell them that you have a job pending this, right? So they can attach some real consequences to their time. This is a place where we can advocate. Just as a side note, complaints and disciplines, complaints are required. They have a mandated 120-day timeline to be responded to in most jurisdictions. So this is a place where I think that we can say, I know you do diligence, do that, right? But we need a window, particularly when there's a job waiting, right? Sorry, I'm rambling.
No problem at all.
It's
I'm curious to ask, like, what advice do you have for reentry workforce providers who work with justice impacted job seekers, especially those who are actually exploring industries like healthcare, education, and finance? Because those three areas are, in some regards, within our field, sometimes considered as closed. So, curious to hear if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, one, if you're a provider or even a job seeker, I think it's important to get to know the law. So I just spoke at my old college on Wednesday, and I was on this exact topic because there was the addiction counseling program there, and I was talking to them about, so I said, so in Minnesota, I said, go to Google and Google Minnesota statute 245C15 and read it, and read all of it, and get to know that, because that's your life right there. That's going to tell you, it's got all the categories: permanently disqualifying, 15-year, 10-year, 5-year, and all, and just find where you fall in there, and that'll start you to know what you can expect. And the sad thing is, like, that there's one category in there, that the permanently disqualifying category, which is the one that I dislike the most, because honestly, so I have a friend who has a aggravated robbery from 1996. He was 19 years old. He robbed a liquor store. He is permanently disqualifying from ever holding a license in the state of Minnesota. And he's 15 years in recovery now, and he's African American, which that workforce we really need. I mean, especially in the overdose crisis, we're seeing Black Americans are 4 times more likely to die of a drug overdose than a white person. So we need, and we know the evidence tells us when we go to seek help, that having a person that looks like us, like that is a huge factor in how successful they'll be in their journey, right? And so, anyways, I think what I think is, just get to know your laws, whatever state you're in. Find out, like, become intimately familiar with those regulations and those laws, so when a person comes to you, like, you can start them on that journey. So that's what I would say for that.
Awesome. Folks, we're going to be starting our Q&A very, very shortly. So if you have any questions, please go ahead and put it in the chat pod, the Q&A pod. But I do have 2 quick questions. If you could just give me like a 30-second response for Randy and Caroline, I'd appreciate it. Curious, Randy, what makes you most optimistic about the future of occupational licensing? I know you talk a lot about the system and the challenges, but is there anything that makes you optimistic?
Well, I think that this webinar is one of them. Just said, getting people educated. I think what makes me optimistic is And I think COVID did this, honestly, and I don't like, there are more people than ever civically engaged in our country, where actually politics means something. Like they show up when there's a rally at the Capitol, they sign up to testify at a hearing. They like I think like what I saw during COVID, especially when we allowed like virtual testimony, is there were so many people engaged in our process in our legislative process, because one of the biggest barriers is access, right? Like when there's a hearing, like I'm lucky, I can usually drop whatever I'm doing and drive 20 minutes to St. Paul and testify at a hearing, right? Not very few people have that ability. During COVID, you could be 3 hours away from our Capitol. You could sign up on Zoom to testify at a hearing. We still have that a little bit. Some of those have gone away, and I wish they would bring it back. But I think the amount of people that I see engaged in those processes is at an all-time high. I mean, I'm 50, almost 55, and I've never seen, when there's a rally or a day at the Hill, like a lot of people are showing up, and that to me brings me a lot of hope and optimism.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Caroline, in the interest of time, 15 seconds, what advice would you give to practitioners who are on this call?
Just keep at it. Don't give up. And the example that I'll use is internationally educated. 20 years ago, regulators said, no way, not happening. Today, regulators are saying we absolutely need to consider them under different circumstances and a different path as part of our workforce cohort because we're short. So keep at it. It's slow, but keep at it.
Awesome. All right. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. I'm going to ask you a few questions. Our audience have taken the time to share their questions. So we want to do our best to get through as much as we can. If we don't get to a question, feel free to reach out to our presenters directly or even to us, and we'll try our best to get back to you on that. Question here from Selena. Selena is sharing a challenge that we have in the field constantly, where an individual gets trained, investment is made to pay for their training, and then after the training, they find out that they don't qualify for a particular license. What do you have to recommend to maybe someone who is training the individual or even the person who have the record in finding out what in advance kind of weird things are with them, given that maybe the crime that they have or something along those lines?
Randy, do you want to start with that, or do you want me to take that?
You can. I mean, what I would just say, only thing quick is like, so at our college, we used to do the background studies at the end of the degree, and now we're doing them on the front end of the degree. So if someone gets disqualified, we know immediately that there's a different path for them. But we changed how we did it at our college because of that. So.
Right.
And I would just say there's actually a link that Kimberly's going to send out after this, and it is a comprehensive view across all states, across all professions of what the requirements are, and it includes moral character, it includes background checks, it includes relationship to the offense, to the profession. And so if you know, and I think it's what Randy said earlier, like just intimately understand and that's a big ask. This language is not easy, right? And I recognize that, and so I apologize. But if you know what it is ahead of time, if you can get ahead of it, and some regulators now are being proactive and sort of outlining paths. In fact, in Canada, there's a requirement for regulators to say, here's the path. For example, in that internationally educated, Jason, that I used earlier, their regulators are required to publish. So for example, if you're a nurse from the Philippines and you want to get a license in Canada or the US, here's the path. Here's how many people are successful. Here's what happens when they're not successful. And here's a bridging program so that we can give you those bits and pieces that you're missing, not all of it, but the bits and pieces, then we can clean that up a little bit. So there is some movement there, but I think it's just really getting at the front end. I think it happens at the front end. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And it makes a ton of sense. So the more you can find out on the front end, better, right? And Randy talked about it. Okay, great. Another question here from Adam Haley. So for states without sunset or sunrise laws in place, what are good ways to affect licensure reform more broadly?
I would say it's lobbying, and I would say it's probably lobbying as a part of the professional association. It doesn't have to be part of the professional association, but the one voice doesn't get a lot of attention. One big voice gets some attention, several big voices. I will say that in terms of government, just generally, if you come to government with a solution, and everybody agrees with the solution, I always sort of say, give them something to say yes to. If for example, a profession comes together and says, like, some of us think this and some of us think this and other of us think that, like, they're just going to get confused, and they're not. One voice from the sector with a solution to government will get you 90% of the way.
Wow. So coordinated strategic effort, right?
Absolutely.
and then,
Absolutely. Do
awesome.
you
I
agree,
had a-
Randy?
Yeah, I had a state senator once said to me, Randy, we don't change, create, or make laws for one person. And he goes, I said, wow, that makes a lot of sense to me. But we do for groups of people, right? So yeah.
And in particular, if several groups come together and agree,
Yeah.
right, then they're like, oh, so they're not going to do something that makes one group upset, which isn't great, but it is the reality, right? Yeah.
There's strength in numbers is what I'm hearing.
There are,
But not just numbers, but coordinated effort that makes sense for what's being asked.
And clear voice, one request, solution oriented, right?
Got it. Awesome. So I have a question here from Heidi Cooper. By the way, Heidi's a faithful volunteer with us in many different ways. So definitely want Heidi's question to be answered. So what Heidi is saying is there's a lack of clarity around where do we find information that we need to be empowered to be educated on the topic. So she's asking this from a regulatory perspective, are there sites or keywords we could use to help research and find information that we need?
So this link that Kimberly's going to send out it's the National Conference on State Legislatures. So this is an organization, right, that monitors legislation that's happening all across the US. They have this, it's done in Power BI. I don't know if any of you are like geeks like me, but it is a phenomenon. I mean, anything you could possibly want to know about a license in a profession in a state, in particular, this piece of it, justice impacted, it's all there. It's in one place and it's up to date.
Okay.
We don't usually have such a good answer.
Great. And again, the resource is already posted in the chat box, so you can click on it and explore it as well. And just so you know, Lanaya mentioned that she's calling every week. She's sending emails. So keep at it, Lanaya. That's great. Awesome. We have another question here from Alisa. Let's see here. It says, what is the employer required to do or to communicate if there is a job offer while waiting the request for consideration? Sometimes my client just sits in limbo and don't know anything. So
I actually know Alyssa. She's from International Falls, which is the most northern point of Minnesota. It might be the most northern point of the United States. I don't remember, but it's 7 hours from me. She's on the Canadian border.
You're Canadian at this point. I'm just going to tell you that.
She works in the workforce center up there, and so I actually know what this is. So this is another one where I really wish I had a good answer for her. So some employers have take them on to do a role that doesn't require them at the time to be non-client contact administrative role, something that doesn't require them to have direct contact with the patients or the clients. That way they don't have to have a completed background study yet. But that's hard because, like, I know it. So at International Falls, there's not probably a lot that maybe you can have her do outside of the person's role. And so that's I hear this all the time, and it's so frustrating to me because I want to do more with this one and there isn't a lot. But some employers, bigger employers, have brought them on to do other tasks while waiting. And then the bad news, though, I'm going to throw that out there, is that then they get disqualified and they brought them in, did all that work, and they can't even work in the position that they thought they're going to. So unfortunately, there's no good answer. I don't know of one.
No, there's no requirement. No, that's their own internal process, and they can decide or not decide. Right?
Awesome. Well, I'm curious to hear about like your thoughts on this. As I shared, Caroline and Randy, please feel free to jump in. But in my experience in this field, recently I started hearing about regulators when I got connected with you, right? So is there really an opportunity for practitioners and providers in our field to maybe work in collaboration with groups or individuals like yourself? Because, oftentimes when regulation does come up, it's almost as if, okay, we're going to have to fight regulation rather than, is there opportunities to partner? How could it be, there could be a mutually beneficial relationship? And if there's not an opportunity, feel free to say so.
I actually think that to the degree, Jason, that you say, I never really talked to a regulator. I never really understood. It's actually the same if you flip the role. So this conversation, I believe, can and should be happening at regulatory conferences, because I think they're equally unaware. So they just handed this, here, implement this, right? But if they understood some of the nuance and started to have this conversation, I really think they just don't know. I think that that's a game changer. So this conversation, just like pick it up and put it, they don't need to know the stuff that I said because they know that, but they need to know the stuff that you guys are talking about, right? And I think they would be open to it. And yeah, I'm happy to facilitate that if there's something that I can do.
Awesome. Well, I'll be knocking on your door, Caroline.
I know it.
Well, and I remember asking Caroline when we first met, when you guys create these rules and regulations, who has a seat at the table, right? And I was encouraged when you said that's actually changed. You've seen that change. Now there are people with lived experience that are invited into those conversations and have a seat at the table, because that, I always say the people that are closest to the problem are closest to the solution. And like, and my wife works in change management, and she always says the biggest mistake like companies and corporations make is they make these new rules, but they don't ask the people that have to implement it if it's even possible and how is it going to get done. And she goes, that's why it fails, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's great. And I want to just throw out there, like, I think like in Minnesota, we have associations, we have NAMI. So if there's a mental health issue, we work with our local NAMI chapter to work on that. If we have an organization called March, which is a really long acronym. I'm not going to tell you what it is, because like I get it wrong every time. But they have a lobbying arm that they work for the treatment industry, right? And I think like there's an organization called the Second Chance Coalition, which it's just run by volunteers, but we've been around Minnesota for a long time. So I think tapping into a local association or an advocacy group, instead of trying to reinvent the wheel and do it by yourself, try to find someone that's already doing it, because they're probably out there if you look. Not always, but could be.
Totally agree. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, listen, we're right at time. I'm not sure if you have any additional thoughts. We actually have about 2 more minutes, so we'd love to hear any final thoughts, any advice that you would share. Please do share that.
I would just sort of say that, part of the problem that I see in regulation is that nobody wants to go first. And like we have this, I always get this vision in my head where, that like whack-a-mole game, right? Like the first person out, right? So if there's back to the coordinated effort, right? Multiple voices agreeing from different perspectives that this is a way forward, give them something that they can say yes to. I just feel like that's a much easier path, and a shorter path, and it's slow. Like regulation is just slow. It lags 10 years behind sort of current day practice and I'm probably being generous.
Got it. Thank you. Randy?
Yeah, well, so I also would be remiss if I didn't mention it's National Recovery Month. So I was in DC yesterday at the SAMHSA's Substance Abuse Mental Health Service Administration's National Walk. And I had a 6 a.m. flight to get back here to Minnesota to be on this. But I would say run. So I'm just going to say it, run for office. Like, we need more people with lived experience in those positions. Like I get civically engaged, meet your legislators. And so federal to me is like, I get too frustrated. I can't stand how the sausage is made at a federal level, but at a state level, you all on this call could have an impact. Like your state elected officials, your House or your Senate or wherever your structure is, they live in your district, they shop at your grocery store, they put their pants on one leg at a time. Go have coffee with them. Like not in session because that's difficult usually, but if they're out of session, go meet with them, talk to them again. And I just say run for office. Like we need more
That's great.
people with lived experience and that are actually doing this work every day to be in those positions where the rules are made. That way, that's how we change the system. So yeah.
What,
Awesome. Well, listen,
one more thing, Jason, we
Go
need
ahead.
good data. We just need good data. And
Mm.
that's a different conversation, but good data always helps the argument, right?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for highlighting that. Again, thank you, Randy and Caroline. Before you go, folks, we do have a survey that we'd love for you to complete. We want to get your feedback on the session. We really value your insight. Consider that as we consider other sessions as well. And we want to know what type of impact this session had for you. That being said, Randy, thank you so much. Thank you, Caroline, for giving up your time. This is a contribution to the field. I also want to recognize and thank Kimberly Crow, who is working behind the scene. Without her help, this webinar would not have happened. So thank you so much, Kimberly. And again, especially grateful for you taking the time, audience, to come and be a part of this. So again, thank you. And our contact information is there. Don't hesitate to reach out. We will be happy to get connected with you or answer any questions that you may have. All right.
Thanks,
So
everyone.
thank you, and
Have a
take
great
care.
day.